Hi, I'm Sean from Tom Woods Driveshafts. We're here today in my garage at home. I'm going to show you how to change U-joints and driveshafts, specifically how you would do it at home in a typical garage setting. The tools we're going to be using are very basic, things that most of you probably have at home. Sturdy bench is the best if you have one. You're going to need a hammer. I like to use a ball peen. If you don't have a ball peen, a claw hammer will work just fine. You should have a couple sockets. Specifically, you want one with a pretty big socket. This is 32 millimeter, but something like that. And then you're going to want one that's about 1 inch in outside diameter. Flathead screwdriver is very useful. Safety glasses. Should always wear safety glasses. Some needle nose pliers. A grease gun. Some rags. And some WD-40. So the first thing you want to do is evaluate whether or not it's a good idea to rebuild the drive shaft in the first place. If you have a drive shaft that looks like this, that is old, it looks like a relic from an old shipwreck, it's probably a good idea to just toss it. Consider the age of the drive shaft. A lot of these are 20, 30 plus years old. They've been exposed to the elements for all that time. One thing you want to take an extra close look at is the spline. So that's where this drive shaft compresses and extends. You want to make sure that you can compress and extend it, that it's not loose, it doesn't rattle, and most, maybe even more important, that it's not seized. This one you can kind of move it. Sometimes these will just be, they're locked down there, you can't move them. In a lot of cases though, it is a viable option to just replace the U-joints. Jumping right into the process, one of the first things you want to do is clean everything real well. So starting with the drive shaft, you can see this drive shaft's really caked with dirt. If you don't clean everything well, once you pull stuff apart, dirt's going to get into all those sensitive moving parts inside the U-joints, inside the snap ring grooves. So I like to take a flathead screwdriver and start by just scraping off the big chunks. And then, once you do that real well, if you have a wire brush, you can wire brush it, and then use a rag and wipe it off. It's also a good idea, good point to use some WD-40. Like, this is super rusty, so we'll give all these bearing caps a soak. And then the WD-40 kind of helps with cleaning the dirt off too. So once you spray it, you can just wipe that down. Likewise, you're going to get dirt on your bench, and you want to wipe all that off for the same reasons. But also, when you take the U-joints off, a lot of times the needle bearings will fall out. And if they fall into a pile of dirt, that U-joint's pretty much garbage and you want to throw it away. The next thing you'll want to do is mark the drive shaft so that when you pull it apart, you can put it back together the same way. This is important because of the alignment and the way the drive shaft was balanced. So for example, this drive shaft, this slip yoke, there's a weight on this side. If we were to pull this off and then turn it 180 degrees and put it back on, that's going to affect the balance. Likewise, even though there's not weights on this casting, it's going to be heavier on one side than the other. So I like to use a paint pen. If you don't have a paint pen, you can just use like a screwdriver and scratch it or something, but just go down the shaft and give it a mark, give it a mark, give it a mark. And then for this one, I'm going to mark an arrow here too, so that I have the orientation this way. So if you are going to try and reuse some of the universal joints, these needle bearings in here, they're held in place by just grease. And on the old shafts, a lot of times the grease is just gone. It might be old and just kind of worn out, and it's not really sticky. So to give those needle bearings some new glue, so to speak, it's a good idea to pump some fresh grease into it. Next, we'll want to identify and remove the snap rings. And what I mean by identify is on this drive shaft here, it has some external snap rings. So the snap rings are right here. You grab them with some needle nose pliers. That's how they're removed. Sometimes they get a little stuck and you have to maybe use a screwdriver to pry them out. And then on others, so this one, you can see it does not have these external snap rings. The snap rings are actually on the inside here. And with those, what you do is you use like a screwdriver or a chisel, you find the edge of the C-clip and you pop that out. So now to remove the joints, so we'll start with this one here. So I've removed these two snap rings here, and then the way I like to do this is I'm really hitting the calf part of this yoke and just giving some slight pressure this way with this hand on that joint. And basically what I'm doing is I'm holding the joint in place, so the joint just stays in place naturally, and then I'm hitting the rest of the drive shaft away from it. And you'll be able to see those, actually both joints are starting to come out. That works most of the time. If they're in there real good and they're rusty, like on this one, one thing that you can do too, this is where these sockets come into play, is you take this socket and you put it here, and what's going to happen is that U-joint's going to go into the socket, and then you take this one, and this one just barely is smaller than the cap diameter, so you use this as a punch, and you punch that U-joint through. Now a lot of times you're not going to get it all the way through, it's just going to go most of the way, so maybe you can get it the rest of the way like this. One trick, if you can't get it out, is turn it around and try and knock it the other way. And then at a point, if you have both caps out a little bit, you can kind of force the needle bearings to fall down, and then those needle bearings fall down inside that cap, and then that gives the joint something to push against the rest of the way. There we go. So that's out. And then if you're rebuilding a drive shaft and it's a double cardan style shaft, which is this, you want to really look at this center ball. Usually if anything is worn out, it's not going to be these joints, it's going to be this center ball. On this one you can actually see there's a little seal that's supposed to be on here, and it's not. So that's definitely bad. The other way to test these is if you take like a screwdriver and put it in there, this ball should be tight. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little bit of up and down movement, which means that's bad. So this is something that needs to be replaced more often than these joints. So make sure you look at this. I'm going to pull this one out too. I'm going to pull this one out here too. Okay, so that joint's out. I'm just gonna leave this one in. Process is the same. And then we're not gonna save these joints, so we'll just get rid of these, throw these joints away. Actually, I'm gonna really throw them away. And then wipe off the bench, get rid of any of those needle bearings or any dirt that fell off. And also the drive shaft too. This is really important here. A lot of times there's going to be in these snap ring grooves, you get dirt inside those snap rings. You get dirt in the bearing cap bores. So this one's pretty clean, but it's a good idea to really just clean everything here before you put stuff back together. And for the snap ring grooves, you take like a flathead screwdriver and just scrape out any dirt that might be in there, especially on the part of where the snap ring is open and there's not contact. We usually get some dirt that forms right in there. So onto the new joints. This is the most common size drive shaft U-joint ever. This is like a 1310 series. These ones that we're using today are a Spicer brand. Part number on this is a 5-153X. It's the most common size. If you go to like an auto parts store, this is the type of joint you're gonna find. Has a grease fitting right here in the body of the joint. And then when you're putting these together, this grease fitting, once the grease fitting is in, actually I'll just put it in. I don't have a nut driver handy, so I'm just going to put it in by hand right now. But once this grease fitting is in here, if you put it in the wrong way and then this is articulating, this grease fitting is going to hit this side here. It's also going to be really hard to get to. So you want to kind of pay attention and think ahead of what's going to be the easiest way to get to that grease fitting and where is it going to freely rotate. So on this, really on the CV, we usually point it away from the center. So on this one, you know, it's kind of pointed slightly away this way. The other one's going to end up pointing up this way. And then to install it, you can see the edge of the joint kind of poking through here. And this is also why you want to get all that dirt out, is because you don't want to get dirt on these trunnions. But the edge of the joint is kind of poking through. I'm just going to put basically the cap already on the joint. Lost my hammer. And then that way you know that the needle bearings are making contact, the needle bearings aren't going to fall over. And then you just hammer it through. And then while still holding the joint like with one hand so it doesn't fall away from the bearing cap, bring it over to the corner of your table. And the reason you want to do the corner is right here, it's kind of like a drum. There's some deflection and absorbs a lot of the impact. So if you take it right over like the corner post of your bench, it's going to be a lot more stable. And then this, it's kind of hard to do with just two hands, but you can use that socket to drive the joint below flush so you can get the snap ring in. Don't put that snap ring in yet, you don't need to yet. Now you can turn it around and do the other cap. Get that one just started. And then the snap ring, these needle nose pliers I have are kind of smooth. They kind of suck, but get that snap ring in and make sure it's fully seated. Turn that around, bring it back to the corner of your bench. Use the socket to get it the rest of the way. And then after you get that in, you're going to notice this joint is really tight. And if you hit the drive shaft, the yoke part of the drive shaft on the side that you just pressed, that'll loosen up the joint. So at this point, you want to remember the marks that you made before. In this case, I have marks on this side, I have marks on this side, and then I had done an arrow pointing at the rest of the drive shaft. So this is going to go on here like this. When you're hammering on these sockets, it's best to put the socket side down, the bolt side down, so that you're not messing up that end of the socket. And then this is this center ball is bad, but I don't have I didn't bring a spare one here to put in, so I'm just going to put this one back on. But inside here, there's some needle bearings. You want to make sure all those needle bearings are there. Make sure they haven't fallen over. And then this is kind of the tricky part, getting this ball lined up on this pin. But you want to line it up, and normally there's going to be a spring on it too, but this one didn't have a spring in it. But you'll feel it slide all the way down. And we're going to grab another joint. And I always like to put, so I've got a grease fitting on this side, so I want to keep, you know, kind of same relative side just so it's easy to get to. But as I mentioned before, the grease fitting on this one, we're going to point the hole kind of away from center. So this one's going up this way, where that other one is going down this way. So that's in. On this one, this last snap ring is not fully seated. Might be hard to tell, but this snap ring here is fully seated. About half the width of the snap ring is hidden. So you can see that's what it would look like. Most of that is hidden, or a lot of it is hidden behind here. This one, it's not quite fully seated. And you'll be able to see, I'm going to take this flathead screwdriver and just give it a little tap. And then that's seated fully. So you want to go around and make sure that they're seated on all of these. And if they're not, maybe even just for good measure, just give them a little tap like this to make sure they're in. And then you put in your other grease fitting. Use a nut driver to do this. If you have a nut driver, use it. If not, you can use just a socket. Socket's a little tough because it's a little wide and it's hard to get in there, but you can do it. Doesn't have to be real tight. Just tighten that down, hand tight. Do the same with the other. Last step here is going to be to grease the fittings, because these U-joints, when they're new, you can see, pull these off, there's a little bit of grease in them, but not a lot. That grease is really just there for packing, keep the needle bearings in place. So once it's all together, you want to give it a good, healthy squirt of grease. If you don't have a grease gun, go get one. You should have one. And then when you grease this, you want to pump grease through until you see it start to come out all the seals. So on these blue seals, it's going to start to kind of squeeze out of those seals, and that's what it's supposed to do. A lot of people think that means the seal's bad, but the seals are actually designed to let grease out. So you grease it until it starts to come out of all of them. Do that to all the fittings. A lot of times there's a fitting on the slip yoke too. This one has one, it's like a flush fitting. On our drive shaft, it's going to be a nipple type fitting, but grease all the fittings. Give everything a new wipe down, especially on these ends, because when you bolt that up to the drive shaft, you want to make sure there's no dirt between here and the yoke. Same thing on this side. You want to make sure that this is clean. And then your yokes too, that this goes into. Wire brush that, wipe it out with a rag, make sure there's no dirt in there, because these need to be really precision, clean, smooth surfaces. So that's it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to give us a call or visit our website.